Hey everybody, I'm Paul Merrill from Beaufort Fairmont Automated Testing Services. I hope you all are doing well today. It's the 5th of November, 2018, and I'm happy to be here. It's a rainy day outside in Cary, North Carolina, a little cold and rainy. Hopefully it's brighter where you are, and we'll brighten it up with this talk about data strategies and how I've updated my views on them recently. So a couple of points real quick as we get going. You'll notice that you have a dashboard from GoToWebinar, a control panel, and you're able in there to do several things. You can ask questions, so there's a question section where you can type in your question. I'm open to you doing that anytime. I will take breaks throughout the presentation and collect those up and ask a few as we go along. You'll also notice that you're able to talk with me through the chat section if you need to. Questions part is fine. And you can also reach your hand up. So there's a little icon in the attendees section that allows you to put your hand up. And I will try to keep track of that. And if people have questions, that's one way to ask them. And when you do that, I will talk about you and you'll be able to talk on this webinar live. So if you're brave enough to do that, that's fine. If you'd rather type in questions and thoughts as we go along, that's fine too. So first of all, once again, my name is Paul Merrill. I'm the founder and principal software engineer in test at Beaufort Fairmont Automated Testing Services. We are based in Cary, North Carolina. We focus on test automation for our clients around the US and in parts of Canada. We do that through consulting, through training, and through dedicated experts. We have people working remotely for a number of companies around the country, helping them implement test automation. And you'll also notice here my Twitter address is dpaulmerrill, so feel free to tag me in tweets, add me to tweets and start a conversation about the things that I share with you in here. A couple of things to get out of the way as we get going here. Number one, I have the B list if you haven't been around in a while, and most of you haven't been here the last couple of months because we haven't had a webinar, and I apologize for that, but it's been super busy, which is a good thing. So the B list is something that I created in order just to say thank you to some of you, to those of you who are supportive and helpful and have done good things over the years, people that over time, over the last few months as well. So it's kind of like the A list in Hollywood, except we're both at Fairmont, so we have a B list. So thank you all very much if you find your name on there. I really appreciate your support, and many more of you, I appreciate your support and your help, and the company appreciates it as well. So thank you very much for all the help and support over time. Secondly, upcoming events. So we have a few things going on. I'll be in Orlando later this week for the Agile DevOps 2018 conference. That's going to be a lot of fun. If you're going to be there, make sure to stop me, find me, come to my session about service virtualization, and let's talk about your test automation challenges. Let's figure out where you are and what we can do to help. Sometimes it's just a conversation that can help you move to the next level. Next webinar coming up is on JavaScript and TypeScript with test automation, and that's going to be super fun. One of our guys, Marcus Myers, is going to be doing that, and I'm looking forward to that a lot. It's going to be great. We recently did a project with JavaScript and TypeScript, and so that's where some of this information is coming from. Montreal, I'm going to be up in Montreal in December. I'll also be up in Buffalo a couple times in the next month. If anybody is in Buffalo, New York, give me a yell. Let's get a cup of coffee. Paul at beaufortfairmont.com or on Twitter, dpaulmerrill. And the Automation Guild is coming up in February. I'm looking forward to that. I'm going to be a part of that. Joe asked me to do that, and the Automation Guild is always awesome. And I'm hoping that we can be more a part of that than just my speaking. So looking forward to more of that. Great. So a couple things, you know that we give away a $50 Amazon gift card every single month with this. So stick around to the end of the webinar if you want to win that $50 card giveaway. And we have given one away for many months, and I'm thrilled to be able to do it. And I hope that people enjoy that gift card. So I want to start out with a question. Why are your tests so flaky? So this is not rhetorical. I'd love to hear your answers, your thoughts. Please share them in the questions section or raise your hand, and I'd be happy to have you chime in here. Let's see what anybody has to say. Sometimes it takes a little while for people to type in here, so we have to be patient. Okay. Okay, here's one from Butch. Butch says, because your environments are so flaky. Okay. One from Allison. She says, flakiness comes from test timeout issues and or changes to the application under test. Ah, those are good ones. Good ones. Anything else? Anybody else have ones they want to share? Let's see what else we have here. Those are both great ones. Oh, Butch again. So Butch says the expected data isn't in place. Okay, that's you're noticing what we're going to talk about here, Butch, and that's good. So, and then somebody says, hey, we don't have flaky tests. Steve says we don't have any flaky tests, and he's kidding, of course. He says usually we have timing problems, and I agree with you. Timing problems can be difficult. Jim says data is flaky. Okay, all right, great. Amos says, it says app restrictions that require most testing to be done through the UI. All wonderful, wonderful answers. So my experience lately has been that the lack of an adequate test data management approach is the #1 reason for flaky tests. This is my experience in the last few years, and I see this again and again and again and again. We work with a lot of companies that are working as hard as they can to have resilient, strong test automation. They want tests that can run repeatedly, give us trusted responses. They want tests that can be consistent and that tell us, did the system under test change? So one of the things that one of the folks here mentioned was, hey, the application under test changed. Yeah, but that's not, in my opinion, that's not flakiness of the tests. That's the test doing exactly what they're supposed to do. The tests are telling us that the system changed. That's what we want. We want to know when it changes. What we don't want is flakiness in the sense of the tests work sometimes, they don't others, and we really have no idea why. My experience has been, again and again, test data management or lack of adequate test data management as the #1 reason. So a lot of you folks have probably seen some of my other talks about data management, about data strategies. And those are all out there. I'm actually going to reference them at the end of this talk. But what I wanted to do today was to kind of go back. I haven't spoken about data strategies in about 1.5 years, and I apologize for the outside noise here. Of course, it seems like every time I go to speak on the phone, there's someone with a blower right outside my window, but that's just the way that it goes, right? So, so I'll say this, it's been a year or two since the last time that I talked about data strategies. And I wanted to take a different approach to it. I wanted to think about it differently. I wanted to see if there was a way that I could update my model, my mental model of data management and how testing relates to it. And then I wanted to share that with you. So that's what I'm trying to do today. So lack of test data management, #1 reason in my experience. #2, I believe test data management is the most underrated, misunderstood, overlooked, and problematic issue facing test engineers. Many times what I find is people giving reason and paying umbrage to problems with tests that are problems, but are much less a source of problems than test data management. I find people overlooking how hard it is to manage test data. I find people not paying attention to it, and I find it incredibly difficult to explain to people that test data management is a major, major issue. And here's where it comes in. A lot of people think, okay, test data management, fine, I'm going to manage my data. I have to have data from production, or I have to have this kind of data or whatever. What we're talking about here is the biggest problem that I see with test automation is we write these scripts relying on data that's in a system. And then when that system's data changes, the test doesn't work anymore. So maybe it passes for the wrong reasons, maybe it fails for the wrong reasons. But what I see is things, for instance, like a race condition. And a race condition is, of course, when you have basically two processes that are trying to rely on the same resource, okay? From your computer science days, you remember this. What I see with test automation is we have multiple tests running at the same time, or the same test running at the same time, or tests running in subsequent runs, all relying on one piece of data that's outside of the memory space of the test. It's outside of the memory space of the application, and it can be changed by many different actors, and we don't have a handle on who's changing it. And when that's the case, We cannot rely on the results of our test automation. So that's where I see this misunderstood, and it's really difficult to explain to people if they haven't felt it. If you felt it, you know what I'm talking about. It's a major problem. It's worth spending time on this problem and solving it within your environments. So a few things that I haven't talked about in the past, or one thing I haven't talked about in the past, is the idea of data and categorizing data. So it's become obvious to me that there are at least two types of data, and then there's a blending of the two types. So number one, we've got organic data that's created out in the wild. And by this, I mean, maybe it's created in other systems, maybe it's created by customers or users, maybe it's created by an entirely different internal system. For instance, many times we have the problem with users being created or managed by things like Active Directory or LDAP or another system entirely. Maybe our users within our system are Facebook users. Lots of that kind of stuff going on these days. You can log into these systems using your credentials from other systems. So if we were to look for user data out to use for our tests, we may go looking in places where it already exists. So let's go look in production, or let's go look in our existing test system and see if there's a user that we can use. Maybe the data in our test system has been pulled in from production, and then we can just go find the data that we need that looks like what we need in order to do a certain test. That's organic data. It exists already. It was created in the wild. It was created in kind of an unmanaged environment, as opposed to synthetic data that's highly managed. It's managed by our test suites, it's managed by our utilities, it's managed in pre-production environments. It's something that we create. Maybe it's in a pre-conditional step of our automated tests. Maybe it's something that we create before an entire suite of tests runs. And then finally, we have a hybrid approach. And this is the one that's probably the most common. And I find that it's more common because it's almost impossible in most decently complex systems today to create a purely synthetic piece of data. And I'm not even sure how to describe these pieces of data. If someone has better terms than I do for this, please share them with me, because I want to learn better terminology for this. I have done research, but I don't have all of the words for this, and I'm not sure that the best. I'm not sure where to go to find some of that information. So if you have better terms, let me know. I have this sense of an entity, and an entity within data is not necessarily just one piece of data or one row in a relational database or in a table of a relational database. It's a piece of data like a user, which is connected to a profile, which is connected to roles, which is connected to credentials, which is connected to actions, which is connected to logs, which is connected to events. All of these things together make up this entity and its relations. And it may be easy to go in and synthetically create that user, but it becomes much more difficult to go in and synthetically create all of the other pieces of it. So many times we end up in a situation where, okay, we got the user from Active Directory, and that's kind of our minimal piece of data that we can use. And then we add to it a particular profile, a particular role within our system, or something along those lines. And there are these kind of hubs of data. So you've got users is one that's very common. Many times you have something like, for instance, if you're in a contract type of application, you have a contract that's very important, and that's kind of a hub of data within that data schema. You also have hubs like a product within a retail system. Okay, so you're selling retail items. Well, these items usually narrow down to products with an SKU on them, and that's that smallest piece of data that you can use. So many times we can mimic or synthetically create one of those hubs, but or one piece of it. So maybe, for instance, we get the user from production, but then we add on the profiles and things like that. So most people are using some type of hybrid of these pieces of data. Before I get into a few other pieces of this, I want to open up to some questions. If you've got questions in mind, start typing them now. I've got a couple queued up here. But if there's anything that's unclear that you'd like to comment on, if you want to share maybe how you use, which of these you use, or why you like organic data versus synthetic data, this would be a great time. So the first one was someone asking about good books or web links for automated testing. I have a whole blog out there for that kind of stuff. So go to beaufortfairmont.com/blog and look back in there. I've got a list of books in there for automated testing. I've got all, web links on there as well. My writing on that blog is good. All of these webinars are good for automated testing. Just pick a subject that you want to learn about and go there. Synchronization issues, failure to understand. So someone was talking about what the reasons are that failures happen and that flakiness happens within tests. A failure to understand how the application changes its state. I think that's key. That's really what we're trying to determine is, does the application or set of applications change its state appropriately? And I want to get into that a little bit more here in just a second. But that's what we're trying to do with testing, is to find out, does it do it in a way that we expect? If not, why do we have a difference? And if we have a difference, who do we tell about it? And how directly and clearly can we tell them at the right time? Here's one. It says, most teams I've worked with manage data via the DB scripts, rollbacks, CSV imports, API calls. Do most teams I've worked with manage them in those ways? So it's really a mixed bag, where most of the time where I find groups that accelerate with test automation moving is they end up managing data within their test scripts, or they have some utility that calls into a database script that can quickly roll things back or create data, but they manage them within their test scripts or within a utility that's available to the test scripts to run. That's where we tend to get when we're maturing with test automation. Most of them start out with a copy from production and they move from there. And really one of the biggest problems with that copy from production is it usually takes a long time to move that into our pre-production systems, although that's getting faster and faster with things like data virtualization and other tools that are out there. But most of the time what I see is people have some type of refresh mechanism. They do it very rarely, once every few months, once every few weeks, whatever it is. And in order for test automation to work and to really take off, we have to be able to manage data more quickly. That's one of the things I want to talk through here in just a minute, is why it is we need the data to begin with, and kind of take a step back there with that. But thank you so much, Steve, for your question. So Allison says she runs with synthetic data, tests run, and then scripts roll back to the original state. Right. So this can be very complex. This can be very challenging with some systems, and it can be easier with other systems. What I find is with a greenfield application, meaning a brand new application that's just been started, it's being created as we're working on it, it's very easy to understand the schema early on. It's very easy to understand how each piece of the application works together. And then when we codify that in scripts, it's easy for someone to go back and learn how the system runs. Without that, when you're in a legacy system that doesn't have those utilities in place, it becomes very difficult after a very short period of time to understand how each piece of the schema fits together, what you need to delete or create or remove or whatever from a particular system in order to clean up after yourself. And this is also, Allison, and I would assume Allison knows this because she's bringing this up, but for others, cleaning up that test data after we either create it or use it and returning it to an original state, and I love the way she says this, to an original state or to a clean state or to a known state, that's very, very important, because at some point your data is finite. You're going to run through all of it. It becomes very difficult over time to find data related to a particular set of behaviors in a system that you can use repeatedly. So returning it to its original state so that other tests can use that data if you've used organic data, or to delete data if you've created that data, that's incredibly helpful for being able to run these tests again and again. So Mike says he typically sees about 70% of test coverage can use organic data, but synthetic really helps with getting closer to 100% of test coverage. A lot of times new features are not in production yet, so there's no organic data. That's absolutely right. How are you going to use data for something that's not complete yet? Now, sometimes we can do that, but in order to do it, we have to modify it or whatever. It's very, very rare that we put code out into production that's not going to modify data in your system. That's kind of the reason we have applications out there, is for persisting the information we get from the system that's out there. So, so yeah, anything new, you're going to have to create your data for it. That's a good point, Mike. Thank you so much. So those are the questions that I have right now. I'm going to move on to this next piece. So I've shown this in the past. It's in some of my other slides. Just making some notes here. Strategies have two parts. You've probably seen me talk about this before. We talked about how we get data, whether it's created and synthetic, whether it's queried and organic. The creational strategy is part one of a data strategy. The cleanup strategy that Allison mentioned is part two of a strategy. So how do we get the system back to a benign state, to an original state, as she mentioned, to a known state, as some people need? Those are big questions. So a couple other terms. I want to throw out there what I'm calling a data strategy. I have not changed this definition yet. I probably need to update it, but I don't know exactly how I would update it right now. If you have a suggestion, please let me know. You're welcome to email me or send me something to Twitter. But a data strategy I call the combination of code, procedure, and infrastructure that affect how tests interact with data to stimulate the system under test. And I think this last part is really key. So I wanted to zone in on it a little bit more than I have in the past. Here's the thing. Data doesn't matter a lot of times. The specific data you have rarely matters. I find testers, automation engineers, quality assurance engineers, I find so many of us get stuck on the idea of data mattering so much. If you take a step back from why we're so attached to one piece of data and why all the fields have to be there and why it has to be so complete and whatever, if you take a step back, what we're doing with automation, with test automation, is we're using data to stimulate the system under test, and then we're using data to verify the system behavior. We're not trying to see if the data is correct. We only care about the correctness of the data insofar as it tells us about the behaviors of the system in most cases. Right? There are some cases where you want to verify data, but those are very, very rare. I was talking with a good friend about this, and I was relating it to the plumbing in my house and the fact that you've got water that comes in from the city. We have city water here. You may have a pump or well water where you are, I don't know. But we have water that comes in from the city, and it goes through pipes to get into the house, and we use that for all of our internal needs. And then you have wastewater that comes out of the house and it goes into a completely different system back to the city, and the city manages that how they may. And when they install these things, I was saying, you know, that's a great metaphor, but the thing is, like, you wouldn't need water to test those pipes and those connections. In fact, you wouldn't want to use water to test those systems after you've built a house. Why? Well, because it could leak, right? If it leaks and ruins the house, it's not a good idea. So he was telling me, well, Paul, what they actually do is they use a type of gas to determine whether or not the plumbing is hooked up properly, whether or not there are any leaks, whether or not there are any issues. And this kind of blew my mind. But of course they would use something different, right? We wouldn't want a liquid ruining the house or leaking without us knowing it into the yard. And plus liquids are going to go down and fall down. But if you use a gas that's lighter than the air around it, you're going to see it rising and be able to see it rise out of the ground or out of a connection somewhere or whatever. That makes perfect sense. Plus maybe you use a gas that has a certain color so you could see it, not just smell it, and find the actual location that the leak is coming from. So they actually use smoke tests, that idea of a smoke test for plumbing. That's a pretty cool idea there. Well, data is very much the same to us. We've got this application like the house. We want to understand, when I put something into the plumbing for that house, what happens to it as it goes along, and do I get it out in the right spot? Are there any leaks? Did something change about that? Like if that smoke came in and it was supposed to be green when it comes out, but it came out red, that's something we want to know, right? So I think we get too attached to the specific data we use in most cases. I see a lot of people saying, oh, I have to use exactly what's out there in production to know that my system worked right. No, not in all cases. Now, there are going to be cases when you want to use data from production, and there are benefits of using data from production. For instance, the variety of data that you get from organic data or from production data, that variety is probably going to be much higher than the variety that you could create with synthetic data. The randomness of it, the changes that you get to it, you cannot predict what humans are going to do with your system, and they will create data that you never would have thought of. If it's a name, maybe you didn't think of the idea of having punctuation within a name. And then here comes a name that has punctuation, or four names within a name, right? Somebody has not a hyphenated last name, but two last names. Someone's using their surname as their first name instead of their last. All these things as testers, we know they happen. But from production, from that organic data, you're going to have a lot more variance of that data if you have a large user base. On the other hand, with synthetic data, it's much more controlled, and you can use a sense of randomness to it. You're not going to mimic what's in production, but you might get randomness that's different than what you would get in production too. So you can use random generators for all types of stuff to make that happen. So that specific data, it just rarely matters. What we're trying to do is stimulate that system under test, make it do something, and then find out, did it do what I expected it to do? If it did, that's great. If it didn't, we want to take the difference, identify what it is, and pass that on to people who can make decisions. That's what we're trying to do here. So feel free to drop in questions or comments anytime here. I feel like I'm going a little fast, but if you want to stop me, if you want to ask a question, this is a great time to do it, or drop a comment, your thoughts about something. I like to use an idea of a minimum viable piece of data. So what is the most naive, smallest piece of data that I can use for something? If we go back to the idea of a user, can I get by with only a username and test what I wanted to test? If not, what all do I have to add? And let me only add exactly what I need to get the system to behave the way that I wanted it to. So why would I do that? Why would I want to use the minimum piece of data? So one reason would be I don't want red herrings in trying to figure out where a problem is. Yeah, here's John. John's, I think John and I talked on the phone about a year and a half ago, if I remember if this is the same John. John says to pinpoint the specific feature or behavior, right? So what are we trying to do with testing? Well, we're trying to find out, does the system do what we expect it to do? What does it do when we don't have expectations? How do we clarify our expectations for the system's behavior? But then in the end, what we really want to do is, in most cases, fix those issues. We want to work with our teammates in development, our partners in development, and give them information that can help them more quickly fix the issue. I have a friend who told me once that he was there to ensure that quality, that the product was a quality product. And I said, well, how do you do that? He says, well, I tested it. I'm like, well, that doesn't ensure anything. It's like, no, it doesn't. Really, we don't do much for the quality of the product. We can tell you about the quality of the product. We can tell you some characteristics or metrics related to what the product or application does. But as developers who are going to go in and actually fix the code, they're also the ones who created the defects to start with. We don't create them when we find them. We're just finding something that's already there, and we don't break software either, as Michael Bolton likes to say. And I wish I could reference everybody that I've ever heard any of this stuff from. They're not all original ideas. And I'd love to give credit where credit is due, but many other great names in this field have thought of these things before me. So the minimum viable data here is the piece of data that we can create to make the system act in a certain way. And when we start looking at how to reduce the scope of a test case, things get better. When we start looking at how to reduce the amount of data we have to work with, things get better. Tests are easier to write, they're easier to troubleshoot, they're easier to understand, they're easier to recreate, they're easier to pass on to development so that developers can fix the issue. And our whole process moves faster when that's the case. So I want to talk about data and how we should be systematic with it. Once again, if you have questions or thoughts, throw them in here anytime. I'm going to look real quick for some hands being raised, if anybody's raised a hand here. While I've been talking, I'm doing this alone today, so trying to keep track of our 62 attendees at the same time as questions and speaking. So nothing there. All right, cool. So systemic data. So for automation to work well, to have successful test automation that's resilient, that's repeatable, that's trustworthy, that is routine, that tells us if the system is different today than it was yesterday, has something changed. We either create data synthetically, and we do that systematically, routinely, uniformly, and with uniqueness in the case of synthetic data, or we can select or query data and reserve it globally in a systematic, routine, uniform way. And you'll notice a couple things here that are common between these two ideas. One, they're both systematic. Number two, they're both routine. Number three, they're both uniform. So what I mean by that with created data, if I create a piece of data, like we were talking about that user, and I'm overusing that metaphor example, but it's fresh in our minds. If we are going to create a user, for a particular test case, for a particular reason, let's create that user the same way every single time. The same way every single time. And when we persist that in code, when we write code to do that, we know that it'll run the same way every time, provided we haven't done something silly with randomness or timing or whatever else. But that's very helpful because it helps us identify the data that we've created. It helps us make sure that since we have done it in the same way each time, we can always go back and change it. We have a persisted historic way of doing it. We can look back in Git or our source code control system and determine, hey, when did we change the way that we create this particular data? We can identify it more quickly, and we can be more specific about what we create. We want to do it routinely, meaning each time we do it, we want to be able to do it again and again and again and create this data. The selected data is much the same way. The uniqueness that I talk about with the created data is that in general, when you create data, in order to not have contention on the data, we can make the data unique to that specific test run and avoid that race condition I was talking about before. So if you create a unique user each time and the user has a unique username, like maybe it's test user and then you have a GUID afterwards, a globally unique identifier or something like that, or some piece of a GUID, then you can always uniquely use that piece of data. You can use it for that one execution of that one test case. That ensures that nothing else will be using it at the same time, and therefore we don't have contention on it. We don't have the case where we've had tests fail for reasons other than we want the test cases to fail. The selected data or organic data we want to look at in terms of some of the same terms. We talk about uniformity there. What I mean by that is uniformity in the way that we select the data. So a human might go in and say, oh, I think this user over here would probably work for what I want it for. I'll just change this one little thing. When we codify this, when we put this into code, into our test automation code, we want to be selecting this the same way each time, the very same query, the very same selection mechanism. If it's some type of, I've seen regular expressions used to find pieces of data. If it's a SQL query, whatever it is, we want that to be the same each time. And if you're doing that, most of the time what you're going to find is over time, the ability to select data, if you haven't cleaned it up, is going to get smaller and smaller. There will be less and less data out there. But at least you know that you don't have the correct piece of data to use at some point in time. That's much more helpful than not knowing. So those are the keys there. Once again, feel free to jump in with questions anytime. I'll take a break here in just a minute. Here's what I would say, the 5 signs you may need a better data strategy. Number 1, the test can only run infrequently. And by infrequently, I would say that there are gaps of more than 24 hours between them. It really depends on context there. So most of the teams that we work with, we've got some suite of tests. It's not a set of unit tests that runs multiple times per day. That's much more frequent. That's what we want. And we want that because we expect unit tests to be there with teams. We expect developers to be writing unit tests. Hopefully they do. We don't have any control over that with what we do. We can try to encourage, we can try to influence, but hopefully they're writing good unit tests that developers can run within a few minutes, that run with continuous integration, that run pre-commit or pre-merge request, whatever it is, but very frequently and very early in the process. And then we're running a few tests after that. So maybe they're service level tests, maybe they're UI tests. Maybe they run every time something's committed. Maybe they run each time something's deployed. Maybe they run every 2 hours. Maybe they run once a night. But when we start getting into the cases where, hey, we can only run our tests every 3 days, or hey, we can only run our tests once a day, you've got some kind of problem. Many times that leads back to a data strategy, and it's because, hey, we only run them infrequently. We can only run them at night because other people are messing with the system during the day, right? Frequent failures. So if you're having flapping tests that sometimes work and sometimes don't, that's not reliable. We're testers. Our whole job is to be reliable. That's the point. If they can't trust us about the system quality and a communication about how the system is working, there's no reason for us to be there. It's worse to have us there if they can't trust us. They'd rather just know they don't know than have wrong information, right? And they being our stakeholders. Failures in different environments. That tends to say, hey, this environment over here connects to database A, environment over here connects to database B, something's different. Well, it could be a lot of things. And I am being inclusive here with some of my definitions. My definition of data, I mean, it could be configuration, it could be property files or configuration files. It could be a database. It could be things that exist outside the system as data or as persisted information that the system uses. But failures on different environments can be a symptom. Repeated runs have different results. We've all seen this. You run a test 3 times, you get a pass the first time, a failure the second time, a pass the third time. What's going on? Well, maybe you're toggling something. Maybe each time a test fails, you have something that toggles the data, and each time it passes, it toggles the data another way, right? Person X has to run the test, so Jimmy has to run the test. Oh my goodness, yeah. We're not even really doing automation if a human being has to be involved. Like that's not even, we're not playing the same sport, okay? That's not, and I want to be careful. Every team is where it is, right? Your team is where it is for good reasons. You've worked as hard as you can to get there, and if you have somebody who has to run the test right now and you're moving towards something else, that's great. But if we run over a long period of time and there's always this one person has to be involved with running the test, it's usually because that person has to do something special. They've developed a specialty with regard to running the tests. When that happens, we have to eliminate that specialty in order to run these tests repeatedly, recurring, consistent, because whatever that person is doing, it's hidden magic and we don't know what it is. We want to take that out and persist it in the form of code so that we can always run these exactly the same way, so that we can know, did something change in the system? What changed? Did something change? So that's where I want to leave you today. Also, go out and take a look at these webinars. You may have seen them on the webinars page. I want to open this up to questions now and thoughts. So if you have comments or questions, please share them. I'm happy to go back and look at a slide with you. We've got a couple other things to do as we finish up here, as people are typing in some questions. We'll do 5 or 10 minutes of questions here if people have them. But these are places where you can go out and look at this. Someone's asking right now, will the slides be available? Send me a note, send me an email, paul@beaufortfairmont.com, and I'd be happy to share the slides with you. Also, this is recorded, so you're always welcome to come out here and see this again and it'll be available at beaufortfairmont.com/webinars as soon as I can get it up, as soon as I can get the recording going there. So a couple of questions here, let's see. Those were the main things, was will they be available? That's fine. If anybody has other thoughts here, you're welcome to share them with me or share them with the group. I'm going to look for hands, see if any hands are raised. Well, and it may be that none of this is new. Maybe all of this is stuff that you guys already know and there are no questions. I hope that's not the case. Here's one by Jeff. He says, does it make sense to verify expected data before a test is run and skip the test if not? Does it make sense? To who? To whom? Does it make sense to verify expected data before a test is run? I have no problem with verifying that data is there or not in order to run a test. So if you're going with the organic data and you're going out and you're selecting data from the system that already exists, hey, look, if the data doesn't exist, then there's no reason to run the test. I'm right there with you, Jeff. On the other hand, if we're saying the test case is marked as failed because the data for the test case does not exist, that I don't like. And the reason that I don't like that, and I don't prefer that, is I like a test case to fail with meaning. I like for when a test case to fail, for it to say, you know, the name of the test, and if it fails, that tells me exactly what the problem is. That's what I want. I want very, very direct information, very like laser focused tests that tell me exactly what's going on, because I can give that back to developers and they can say, oh, I know what happened, I can fix that. If I have 1,000 test cases that all fail because we have a step before every single test case that says, is your expected data there? That's not helpful to me. What would be helpful is a test case or something that goes out and checks to see if all the data is there or if a significant amount of the data is there, and then tells me about it. And when that one fails and I don't run all the others, then I look at the report and it says, oh, look, 99 or 999 test cases did not run, and one test case failed because the data that we need to run those other 999 is not available. That is high signal to noise ratio. That tells me exactly what the problem is and what I need to fix in my environment or something else. So that's kind of where I come from on that. And thank you so much for your question, Jeff. So let's see. Some of these questions I can't answer right now. And I'll maybe I should try to get back to Lee. You're one of those. If you come back to me with some of these questions afterwards, I'll be happy to try to answer. Do you have automation that can create extreme data values for you? I don't know what extreme means, Dwayne. So if you can help me understand that, I'm going to guess that what you're talking about is boundary cases with regard to data or things like that. So for instance, if there's a set of heuristics that I'm trying to explore, like you know, max int plus 1 or max big number plus 1 or minus 1 or whatever, those types of things. Yeah, I mean, I've written automation for that. Do I have automation that can create extreme data values for you? Yes, we have written that for our customers. We don't have anything that we can just provide you with off the shelf, but I'm always happy to talk through those. One of the things that I always do is a free consultation for folks. I haven't talked to this today. But I always do a 1 hour free consultation to talk about your testing challenges, your test automation challenges. We can set up a time for that. You can bring your team or just you and one of your coworkers or just you yourself and talk through your specific challenges. And that gives us a chance, it gives me a chance to focus on you and your question and what's going on in your environment. And this might be the case where we could do something like that. But certainly we've created many times we create utilities for our clients to generate data that's helpful to them. Sometimes that means generating data related to boundary conditions or negative conditions or whatever else. Sometimes it's just to be able to do a positive test case. So many uses for data on that. Thanks for your question, Dwayne. Sam, you're welcome. Thanks for the comment. He said, thanks for these webinars. Let's see. How do you handle sensitive data? Oh, this is a great one. This is Nikhil. Nikhil, thanks for this question. He says, how do you handle sensitive data? I keep it in an encrypted XML. He's going to tell us how he keeps his sensitive data. I'm not going to repeat it. All right. So Nikhil, don't share how you keep your sensitive data. And that would be one way to keep it safe. So how do I handle sensitive data? Well, there are a lot of different kinds of sensitive data. There's data that's sensitive because it's personally identifiable. There's data that's sensitive because there are security implications. There's data that's sensitive because it is intellectual property for someone and can't be shared. Many different types of sensitive data, so we'd have to drill down into that. Each case may be slightly different. How do we handle that? So I'm guessing you're asking, Nikhil, in the sense of, all right, I've got to write test automation. I want to have data that's appropriate to expose the behavior I'm trying to test. And the only way I know how to do that is to use data that is organic. But the organic data is sensitive, and I don't want to expose that. In fact, I may be required by regulations or laws not to expose that. So one tool that a lot of companies use is data masking, and there are providers out there for this. I know that CA Technologies, I believe one of the Hewlett-Packard derivatives has a tool for this. There is Delphix that does this. There are numerous different tools. I think Parasoft does this as well. But there are many different tools out there that will help you mask data and do it in a systemic way. So we keep talking about doing this systematically. So those will help you take data. Let's say that it has social security numbers in it. We identify that field within a configuration file. That configuration file or data will tell the data masking tool what needs to be masked out of that. Let's say that it's a social security number, so it'll change it by, I don't know, doing some algorithm against that social security number, or changing it to a well-known fake social security number, or something like that. So there are a lot of ways to handle that. I can't go into all the ways to do it, but hopefully that gives you a little bit more of an idea. Here's Allison again. Allison says, how do you feel about data-driven tests where data is stored in Excel spreadsheets? And just bear with me as I read the rest of this. So I'm all about data-driven tests in the right context. So I'm starting to sound like a context-driven tester, and I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that, but we can talk about that some other time. Data-driven tests are ones where we have basically a template of a test case, and we pass in different pieces of data or different permutations or combinations of data entities or datum in order to run that template many times with different information to see what happens, or to make sure that the same thing happens each time. I love that. I love having data-driven tests. How do I feel about it stored in Excel spreadsheets? Well, I guess if your team is comfortable with Excel spreadsheets and that's what they do every day and that's what they want to use, that sounds great. If it's effective for you and works for you, that sounds great. What I've seen though is that there used to be a well-known kind of pattern with test automation where with some of these tools that were proprietary and used long ago, I'm not sure that it's so much the case anymore, but there was a pattern of, hey, we'll write up a bunch of automation in this tool over here, and then we'll have an Excel spreadsheet that people who can't do coding or who can't use the tool or who don't have a license can create. My problem with that kind of stuff is multifaceted. The number one problem that I have is context shifting. It feels to me, my experience with shifting from window to window to window to window to window is that I lose focus. I just do. I don't know if other people are this way. I certainly do. That's my feeling about that. I like to be in one integrated environment. I personally like to work in an integrated development environment, an IDE. Number two is that I believe that this strategy was created in order for us to have people doing automation that don't write the code. And I really love having people, giving people, empowering individuals to get into the code if they want to in a managed, clear, clean way underneath a process and a plan and all those types of things, which is why we do consulting for companies and whatever. But I feel like that's a good way to separate people, and I really don't want to do that. It also kind of leads to this pattern of like this elite test automation engineer that can go in and work with the code, and then everybody else just works in these spreadsheets. I don't think that's a great way to help people advance their careers in the way of automation or programming if they want to go that way. I also think that, like I said, this was really a way around the shortcomings of a lot of tools earlier on. Now we have test drivers, we have Cucumber, Robot Framework, Gauge. We have a lot of different tools out there for doing things like data-driven testing and many other approaches, keyword-driven testing and whatever else. So Allison, that's once again, wonderful question. I love that. We're starting to run out of time here. I'm going to take one or two more questions. And this is great. You guys are so wonderful to bring these questions. I wanted to leave plenty of space for this, so I'm glad that you are participating. We're having this conversation. Have you had an experience with a client test team that has no control over data source? The data, other teams own the data, and what was your approach to the situation? This is a wonderful question. This is from Stas. I hope that's the proper pronunciation, but thank you for your question. So absolutely, this happens a whole lot. I find divisions of responsibility within so many teams that are helpful in terms of allowing people to specialize, in allowing people to be more productive. However, many times the boundaries that we find between teams and roles can be very debilitating to the ability of the team overall to produce. So said another way, a simpler way, hopefully. I like to have my hands in all different pieces of the application and code. I'm able to do that because I've done this for a lot of years, and I've seen a lot of things. I started out in software engineering. I have a very strong background in computer science, in programming, in infrastructure, in management, in leadership, in all of these different areas. And for me personally, I see these teams and these companies as working towards shared vision, towards shared goals. If you're not, there's a problem much higher up the chain than me, but we all got to be working on the same page, all working together. The challenge usually comes down when you don't have control over data source. What you're usually saying is, not only do I not have control over the data source, I don't have any way to get the data source changed. It's not just that I don't have control, it's that there's no entry to getting it changed. That means we have to either create an entry point or find a way to align the goals of the teams. And that can be difficult because many times the team that manages the data or manages the data schema or manages the infrastructure or whatever else, they have a different set of priorities and responsibilities than we do. So we have to get our managers or our managers to line up our priorities and find ways to align priorities so that everybody moves forward. And that's a management leadership issue most of the time. How do I go about handling it? Well, I usually try to find the person with the most pull and get them to help. This is one of the reasons it's so great to make friends and to be nice to people. People like working with people they like. So be nice to people, get to know them well, ask them questions about what they do, learn about their experiences. And then when you're in a position to help them. And when they're in a position to help you, get them to help you as well, if time allows and priorities allow. But I don't have a clear-cut answer to that, Stas, but I really appreciate the question. So we have 5 minutes left. That means that it is time for the Amazon card giveaway. And today, I believe I have a drum roll for this. Let's see if it works. It worked. Okay. Today, the person that's going to win that is Allison M. And Allison, I will be sending you to the email that you registered with the $50 Amazon gift card. Thank you so much for all your participation and for being here today. Once again, folks, please reach out to me with questions, comments. If you want to schedule some time together, let's do that. I will make time, we'll find time to work together. And when you come to the point where you want test automation in your environment to improve, give us a call at Beaufort Fairmont. We are We are growing like crazy. We've got more business than we can handle right now, but we're always looking for more. We want to find the right business partners to work with, ones who share the same values that we do, ones that that are looking to improve and willing to do the hard work to move forward. And we can help you with the heavy lifting if you want. We can help you with the planning if you want. Any piece of that, we're more than happy to help with. So give me a yell. Once again, thank you so much for your time and have a wonderful, wonderful Monday. Thank you.